Have you struggled in language learning before using the traditional approach? You tried memorising vocabulary and grammar rules and you found yourself not getting far. And the things you did understand, you had to translate in your head so that you were always a second or two behind the conversation that was happening. I had the same myself with Chinese, and I was persevering for years and years trying to learn vocabulary lists and grammar rules, and actually I found myself not getting anywhere. It was only when I began to read stories that I started to make some real progress. And it wasn't learning grammar and vocabulary, it was just reading these stories. And it was here that I found comprehensible input, and I actually felt a bit annoyed at the teachers I'd been persevering with grammar and vocabulary for years, but the research since the 70s shows that it doesn't really work. So I don't know why teachers are still persevering with it. And if you're a new language learner, you don't know this other stuff exists. And there's a whole world out there that talks about comprehensible input and other types of learning that aren't the traditional way. Comprehensible input is the idea that adults learn languages the same way that children do. So not by learning rules, not by learning lists and lists of information like vocabulary. They pick up words from understanding them in context. They understand the context of what is happening, and then they naturally acquire the language that way. And that's what we should try and do as adults when we're trying to learn our first foreign language. Now, the key thing is that we understand the message that's being communicated. It's not about immersion and throwing yourself into a world that you don't understand anything of. It's about starting with easy things where you understand the context and it's comprehensible to you. And when you understand the message and what's being said, it's at that point you start to pick up new vocabulary. Does grammar come naturally? You don't have to study the rules. My English is pretty good. I can't tell you any single rule in English grammar, but because I've acquired the language, like all learners do, that's why I can speak it. It's not by remembering rules. I don't stop myself mid-sentence and try and say, oh yeah, how do I explain that sentence in English? It just happens. And that's the same way that we can learn foreign languages. Now, the difficult thing with comprehensible input is everybody learns slightly differently. And what I mean by that is not that I'm a visual learner, someone else is an audio learner. What I mean is we all like different stuff. I quite like reading, and that's what got my Chinese going. But now that I'm doing some Spanish, I'm just watching videos. I'm just watching videos and listening to podcasts in Spanish, and that's all I do. I don't have to put in any effort. I have to put in time, but that's all I'm doing in order to acquire this foreign language. So as an adult, you might have tried a foreign language class, or you remember what it was like in school, and in your first class, you're being required to try and produce some of the language. You learn a new word in that foreign language, and then you have to try and produce it yourself. But the issue is, you haven't heard enough of the language to understand all the tones, and so consequently, you produce that language with really poor pronunciation. Not deliberately, but because your ear isn't yet attuned to how that language works. Comprehensible input works by just having massive amounts of input, and you get used to the language naturally, like children do. So some purists would say that if you wanted to get good pronunciation, you would wait to speak in that language until you have enough of an idea of how that language sounds in order to start producing it. But not everybody does. There's plenty of people who try comprehensible input, and they also say from day one, you should start being able to speak, or start trying to speak rather. What you'll find though is you don't have enough vocabulary in order to be able to speak. So the main thing is that there is no way around the fact that you need hundreds of hours of input, if not more, depending on the level that you want to reach in that language. And after that is just time. You just need to keep persevering with getting more input. But the idea with comprehensible input, the clue is in the name. You need to be able to understand enough of what's being said to you. If you just put on, let's say you're learning French, just put on French radio 24/7 and you knew zero French, you'd be unlikely to pick up huge amounts of the language because it's not yet comprehensible to you. And that's why sometimes immersion, from what I understand, is not always the best way. Certainly I found that using this comprehensible input approach, my speed in picking up Spanish has been so much faster than tried with Chinese. I just put the radio on, it will just seep into my head. It doesn't work like that. You have to understand the message that is being said in whatever someone's trying to communicate to you, and then slowly you'll pick up the language that way. So it goes without saying, when you think about it, you don't have the target language in you. You need to get enough of it through hundreds of hours of input before you start to produce it. And whilst hundreds of hours of input might sound a lot, think of how many hours of input a child gets before they start to speak. So can speak early if you want to, but you don't have to rush, you don't have to try and produce any of the language yet. Just focus on getting enough comprehensible input, and you can search online. Certainly if you type in whatever your target language is online and comprehensible input, or whatever your target language is and TPRS or something like that, you will end up finding some videos that you can watch where hopefully someone's done them at a level you can start to understand. And at that point, when you can start to understand more of the spoken language without the visual clues, you can start to graduate into podcasts and things like that. But it's simply through, I was going to say immersion, not immersion, but through an approach where you're understanding the message that the speaker is saying to you. It's not that you learn all the vocabulary and all the grammar rules. Let's say your target language has a book of all the grammar and a book of all the vocabulary. They would be big books, but let's say they existed and you memorized all of it. Would you be fluent in that language? Probably not. You might know a lot about the language and all the rules and how it all pieces together as a puzzle. Can you produce it fluently? Can you go and watch movies? Can you go to a bar and chat with people? Probably not. And certainly what the research says, and there's enough people talking about it, this comprehensible input type method where we acquire the language naturally, we don't study it. I haven't done any studying of Spanish, and I can now understand people just talking to me, what seems fairly normally, and it's been effortless. So what you have to do is find material that is comprehensible to you. So search your target language and comprehensible input, or TPRS or something like that. Find a level that works for you. Start watching those videos, and once you get to the stage that you don't need those visual cues, you can graduate to just focusing more on the audio. If you can find some podcasts that are about some interesting stuff geared at language learners that is comprehensible. Now whenever I drive the car, I'm doing the washing up, I walk the dog, I'm constantly listening to stuff. I'm getting hours and hours of extra input. I don't have to study anything. All I have to do is just pay attention to what I'm listening to, and slowly I'm acquiring the language naturally, just like children do. So this is the first video on the channel. Let me know what you think. You can hit subscribe below because apparently that's what people do, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.